If you'd like, you can be making your way over to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12, we're going to begin there in just a minute. Last week in our study, we talked about contentment. And I always enjoy when you share with me afterwards thoughts on what we're studying about. And last week was more than usual because a number of people said, I really needed to hear that lesson, which tells me something. It tells me that this is something that we all want, but we all struggle with. That the idea of being content is the desire of everyone, yet there is difficulty within it. And so that's why the Apostle Paul says it's something you learn. I've learned in all states to be content. I've learned who's the one who gives contentment. This morning, we come to another topic that's not an easy one to talk about, and that's the topic of joy, which might not seem to match up as a difficult thought, because whereas contentment is discussed in the Bible, joy is discussed many times more throughout the Scriptures. Yet it's also one of those things that everybody wants, but sometimes can prove rather elusive. And so it would not surprise me at all this morning if when you heard the topic or you're hearing the topic of the lesson right now, you're thinking, I don't have that joy. And oftentimes we make it worse on people, don't we, when we say, why, Christians ought to be the most joyous people on the face of the earth, which is true. However, if you're struggling with it, it's kind of like when you're sick, somebody saying, you know, you really ought to be well. Yeah, I know that, right? I understand that. So how do we have that joy that should be the commonality of the people of God? This morning's sermon is not going to cover every facet or every angle, come anywhere close to doing that. But what I'd like to do is to talk to you with this idea in relation to Jesus Christ, in relation to who He is, and how the writer of Hebrews could say that the joy that I think you and I are after was the same joy that was set before Jesus. So let's enter into that study and talk about what the writer has to say. In the first couple of verses of chapter 12, the writer is comparing all this to a race. And he's going to talk about running this race and how we do that and what's going to be the outcome of that. But before we get started with discussing this race, let's back up just a bit to chapter 11. If you remember, chapter 11 are these little vignettes of all of these people through history. And here we find people such as Abraham and Sarah and Moses and all kinds of people, and their faith is being demonstrated and their faith is being illustrated, and the writer's going down through the list. And as he gets to the conclusion of that section, he says, having faith is not always something that in the short term is going to bring great things. In fact, let's just look together here in verses 37 and 38. He says, they were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword, they went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. That sounds like one of the most unjoyous things you could imagine. Stoned to death, cut in half, losing your home, wandering about. So here the writer has been with great force discussing faith and the benefits of it, yet here he's saying can be the short-term consequence. And so you're kind of waiting and you're thinking, okay, now he's going to go to something that's going to be the reward for these people. But again, we come to something a little bit strange. After discussing all of these things, he says in verse 39, and all of these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. Not only were they faithful, not only did they suffer all these things, some of them being put to death, he says they didn't get what was promised. But we stopped a little early, didn't we? He goes on to say, verse 40, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. All these people of old, these people who lived before the cross, these people who were faithful to God, he says they didn't get what was promised to them yet. Because he says, I want to bring everybody together. And whether you lived in those days or whether you live in these days, he's saying all are waiting for that promise that's going to be fulfilled through Jesus Christ. And so the recipients then of this promise, some have already run the race. Some of us are running the race now, but the promise is the same, and God is saying, I am going to give the reward to those who run. Let's talk a little bit about this race. When you and I read this passage, if you're like me anyway, first thing that comes to mind is kind of like our modern races, where you got all the contestants, they line up, and if they're running track, they've each got their lane that they can get into, or cross country, there's a trail. Likely, that's not what we're talking about here. One of the really popular things from Greek and then Roman culture was to have more of the obstacle kind of races. Yes, you're running, but you're going to have to get through certain things. And there have been groups that have tried to mimic these today, and they'll put big obstacles in the path, and it's a race of endurance that you've got to get through. And so it's no surprise to us then that when we see all of this, we're going to have that concept of endurance in mind when the writer says, after going through all of these people of faith, he says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. And then for the motivation, he says, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Have you ever noticed how these two sections match up in the writing style? How as the writer is telling us about our race and telling us about Jesus, he's inviting us to make comparisons. Let's take a look at it. If you note the phrases that are used here, to us, he says, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. As he's talking about Jesus, he says the joy that was set before Him endured the cross. So what we find is that both we and Jesus are called on, He was called on, we are now called on to endure. Notice the matchup here. We endure the race. He endured the cross. We also find something set before us. We find the race set before us. We find the joy that was set before Him. So as we think about running this race, and the writer inviting us to look at Jesus, the writer is saying, you need to consider the joy that Jesus had that was His motivator to endure. You need to consider the joy that was laid before Him that encouraged Him to finish this race. So there's an obvious question. What is that joy? Here we find joy pictured almost as the trophy that's sitting just across the finish line. And as the writer tells us about Jesus, it says He's looking at that trophy, He's looking at that joy, and that's what's giving Him the encouragement to finish what He's begun. What is that joy? I think we find it right here within this verse, or this section, when it says that He was motivated by that unity to be with the Father. It says that when He finished His race, the end of verse 2 shows us, that He's seated at the right hand of the throne of God. We need only look back to the Gospel of John, to as Jesus who's praying that prayer, and He's talking about the unity that He has with the Father and His desire, now that the race has been run, to be reunited with the Father. That's joy that's motivating Him to finish that race. But I don't think it's that alone. Because if we look earlier in the book, we're also finding a unity that Jesus is having with the fellow runners on this race, the fellow people who are trying to finish this race. As we go back to chapter 2 of the book of Hebrews, the writer says, "But we see Him, who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God He might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting that He, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. For He who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source." Listen to what he says. "That is why He is not ashamed to call them brothers." That's a humbling passage, where Jesus is saying, "I have come to fulfill my Father's will in bringing many sons to glory, in calling many brothers." And so as Jesus is running His race, as He's enduring His race, the motivation that He has is to be united with His Father once again, having completed the desires of the Father, but also to bring all of us with Him. That's the joy that was set before Him. In keeping with that parallel, then certainly you and I could see that the same joy should motivate us. So if I'm struggling to have that joy that I know I need to have that's spoken of throughout, one of the things I can do is to say, if Jesus was motivated by this, so I can be motivated. I am motivated with that desire for unity with God. What that's doing is it's completing what was begun on the first page of the Bible. When God said, "I have created man in my image," He's talking about a fellowship here, the reason for our creation, that we and God can be together eternally in this grand paradise. But I want you to notice something else with me. As Jesus is giving the parable, we call it the parable of the talents, where He's dividing up these monetary sums with His servants, two of the three do exactly what He wants. They take the talents, they make more with the talents. Have you ever paid attention to the master's words to them? We oftentimes focus on the unfaithful. You ever paid attention to what He says? His master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little, I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master." That's a rather oddly worded sentence, isn't it, as we think about it? But here we find Jesus in this parable picturing joy as something we can come into. It's not something that we're necessarily out to get, but rather by what we're doing, we're coming into that joy of the master. What does He mean? It's that fellowship. Here, you've got the master and the servant working hand in hand in unison. The servant's fulfilling the will of the master. Therefore, they're welcomed in. And the point Jesus is making is, that's exactly where we need to be. So the joy that I can have is found in having that relationship, that unified relationship with God. As well, it can be found in the unity with fellow runners. We find that all over the place in the Bible. It's hard to narrow it down. Let me give you just a couple of examples, though. I particularly like this one that we find in the book of Acts. It says, "So being sent on their way by the church, they passed through both Phoenicia and Samaria, describing in detail the conversion of the Gentiles, and brought great joy to all the brothers." When someone is baptized, it is an exciting time. There are a lot of folks who are a little afraid, I suppose, a little nervous about being baptized in front of a group, and that's perfectly fine. But it's always such an encouragement when someone does make that confession of faith before Christians and they're baptized into Christ with others witnessing that, to then watch what happens afterwards. You ever notice that? You'll have a person in our building standing here at the front, and the line will kind of sleek around this way and down the aisle. Everybody wanting to say something, hug. Why? It's this. When these brethren heard about what was going on with the Gentiles, this was exciting in a whole host of ways, with God tearing down that division, but it's also just simply the fact that here is excitement that someone has made that decision. We share in that. That should bring joy to us. Another very interestingly worded passage we have in 2 Corinthians. Paul says, besides our own comfort, we rejoice, which is the same word there. We had joy, still more, at the joy of Titus, because his spirit has been refreshed by you all. Look at the chain there. Here, they had treated Titus in a very good way that brought joy to him, and Titus comes back and tells Paul and his associates about it, and he says, we had joy because he had joy because of what you had done for him. You see how that works? We're joyful when someone comes into the family of God, and yet we're also joyful when we see people behaving themselves as godly people should. We could go through so many passages. But just consider from these two that whereas Jesus had that joy set before Him, so do we. So then, the writer is going to instruct us. You need to stay on course. You need to make sure that this race that you've begun, you don't quit. Just as Jesus continued on and He finished the race, you do the same. And He tells us how. First thing He's going to say is, you got this great cloud of witnesses that are surrounding you. Who is that talking about? Well, in general, what we can see is we're talking about this united group of people who have been saved by our Lord. Now, if we get into specifics, surely we're looking back to Hebrews 11, since we just finished that section. And we see all of these people who endured terrible things. He's saying it's kind of like you look out, and here's this stadium full of people. And every one of them has a story, but what every story has in common is that they had faith in God. They had trust that He was going to be able to get them there. Hebrews 11 is a rather challenging chapter of the Bible. That was brought painfully aware to me one time when I was visiting a congregation, and in the Bible class we spent 45 minutes trying to figure out why Jephthah is included in Hebrews chapter 11. And it was a sight to behold. The teacher drew out all kinds of charts and things on the board. But at the end of it, I was more and more convinced I don't really have to have the answer to that. Because what chapter 11 is saying is not these people got it right all of the time. What it's saying is they got it right in the moment. When they were put to the test, they trusted. And while their lives may not have gone in the direction that it should, and like everybody else they struggled, here are these little photographs in time of people trusting God. And the writer says, you got all of these folks. Now, he's not saying they're all sitting on clouds watching us right now. That's not the point. What he's saying is, they did it. They were human just like you. Same foibles, same quirks, same difficulties. They did it. But I don't know that we need to stop there. Because as we go down to verse 22, the writer says, but you have come to Mount Zion. Notice that's talking about we're there now, not in the future. You have come. You have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in feastal gathering. So this draws out the picture, doesn't it? That when we talk about people on earth, When we talk about people in heaven, what we're finding is this Eden-esque picture of heaven and earth united together in God. And the writer is saying, you got witnesses everywhere, people like you, heavenly beings. You've got all of these witnesses that are showing you you can trust that God can save. And he goes on to say that we are citizens of that city of God. Not we will be, though we will be, but right now, if we are Christians, we are citizens of that city. Our names are enrolled in the record books of that city of God. And that should bring joy. Let's continue on and see what else he says. He said, one thing you must do, though, is to lay aside every weight and sin. Sin, from Genesis chapter 3, has been the problem, hasn't it? We look at Adam and Eve, we look at Cain, we look at Lamech, we look at the people of the flood, we look at Ham, we look at the people of the Tower of Babel, and what we're finding is that this great promise that was made in Genesis 1 and 2 is forfeited over and over and over again. And so the writer says, look, if you want to be a part of all of this, if you want to be a part of all of these witnesses, then what you've got to do is to put that sin away. Now notice how he describes it. He says, which clings so closely to you. It's all around you. And he's keeping in this racing motif because the concept is you're trying to run the race, you're trying to get through the obstacles, but you got something that's tripping you up. It's something that's keeping you back. And he says, what you must do is to lay all of that aside. That phrase shows up several times in the New Testament. Doesn't always translate exactly like this, but the words are the same. Let's look and see what we find with these different laying asides. Paul wrote to the Romans and he said, the night is far gone, the day is at hand. So then let us cast off, same words, let us lay aside the works of darkness. We go on in Ephesians and he says, lay aside, put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through sinful, deceitful desires. He goes on in chapter 4, verse 25, therefore having laid aside or put away falsehood. And then finally we find in Colossians, but now you must lay them all aside. Anger, wrath, malice, slander, obscene talk. You see what all these have in common? The concept of laying aside is to take everything that is not like Jesus Christ and remove it. Anything that we are letting cling to us that is not like Jesus is going to trip us up in this race that we're trying to run. He says, lay aside the sin. And he also says, lay aside the weight. Maybe synonymous. But I wonder if perhaps what he's also saying is there are other things that can wear you down and keep you from finishing this race. Maybe it's wanting too much out of this life. I've given myself to the Lord, but not fully. And so I want to be a part of everything. I want to be involved in everything. I want to live life to its fullest. Well, that's a weight on me. Because what that's saying is, I'm not going to have enough room for Jesus in that. He's not going to share space. Might it also entail that sometimes it's carrying this bulk of forgiven sins? Do you struggle with this? Have you ever prayed over and over for God to forgive the same sin? Not that you're committing it continually, but that you committed it and you ask His forgiveness and you ask again and you ask again. You have that problem? I do. Because here is something that God has said, I'll forgive, but it's almost to the point of I can't really believe that He's done it. It was so bad. That'll weigh us down. That's what will keep us from having joy. If here all of these sins which God has said, I've forgiven them, I've taken them, I've cast them into the depths of the sea, I've separated them from you as far as east is from west, they're gone, they're done, they're blotted out, but yet I'm still reliving it over and over and not knowing, at least in my mind, to have the confidence that I'm forgiven. What does that do to us? What about carrying the weight of an undue fear of losing our salvation? I think we struggle with this. I'm certainly not a believer that once you're saved, you can never lose that salvation. The Scriptures clearly teach contrary to that. But the Scriptures also teach that there is a God in heaven who is doing everything within His power to keep you on that race course. And if I'm constantly fearful, I don't know if I'm saved, I don't know if I'm going to heaven, I don't know if I'm right with God, I'm going to have this weight that will never allow me to know the peace of God, will never allow me to know the love of God, because I'm always in this constant state of worry, and a worried consciousness cannot be joyful. That's what we lay aside, so that there is nothing holding us back on this course. Let me just add here, I need to make sure that I'm not a weight on somebody else. I always like Brad McCowan's prayers, because Brad always includes something about let us not be a burden to the elders so that we can make their work joyful. That's a good phrase, Brad. Am I that weight on somebody else? So here's a congregation that could be going 100 miles an hour, but it's not because I'm weighing it down because of my orneriness about something or my unwillingness about something, or just simply for the fact that I'm content being the weaker brother. Is there someone else who could be running the race, but they're having to stop and pick me up constantly? No, we have to do that for one another. But if it is a perpetual thing, I need to realize there's a problem that needs to be corrected. I do not need to put someone else in the responsibility position of having to stop and pick me up constantly along the way. These are things that God is telling us, lay them aside. Yes, we need each other. Yes, we all have our struggles. Yes, we all need our help. But we must never find contentment in being weak. And we must never put our brother to the test simply because we're unwilling to grow in our relationship with God. But let's come to the ultimate here. He says in verse 2, looking to Jesus. That's what it's all about, isn't it? Whether we're talking about contentment, whether we're talking about joy. He's going to go on in verse 3 to say, consider Him. That is the exact same word. In fact, it looks almost identical, the first part of it, to analyze the situation. So we know about analysis. It's taking all the details, all the facts, coming to a conclusion. So the writer encourages us to analyze Jesus. Look at Him. Consider Jesus. Because what we're going to see is we are going to see how He endured. Why? So that we can endure. What are we going to see? Well, first of all, we're going to see that He completed the race. He founded what we're talking about, He completed what we're talking about, and He prepared the way for us. How? The text here tells us that He bore His cross, just as He calls on us to bear ours. So when I think about taking up my own cross, I'm not the first one to do this. Jesus has done that. And what did He do? He finished the course. What else does the text tell us? It says that He endured hostility as we endure hostility. As John records for us in chapter 15, if they hate me, you need to understand fully they're going to hate you also. If Jesus did it, what He's saying is you can expect it, but you can endure. Are we ready for that? I think we're at a time where that's going to become much more fine-tuned, where we're going to have to stand up and to say, this is what I believe. It's what Jesus did. It says He also put up with the shame. It's kind of like He laid it aside. Here was the shame that He was given by the Pharisees not believing that He was fit to be teaching, by dying a criminal's death. It says that He dealt with that. We've got to do the same. And so in every case, what the writer is saying is, He completed His race with joy, so you can complete yours with joy. He did it so that you can do it. So then this is how we endure. This is how we complete that race. And as the writer finishes things up, he says, look, don't grow weary. This is a weariness that's sickness-induced. It's kind of like when you get a fever and you just don't even have the strength to crawl out of bed. He's saying, don't let yourself get into that situation spiritually. Don't let yourself get so encumbered with sin, so weighted down with the things of this world, so weighted down with misunderstandings of God that you just simply get sick and you fade away. And he says also, do not grow faint-hearted. Don't quit. Don't quit. Quitting is kind of a natural thing, isn't it? Something doesn't go well, quit. Something's not going my way, go another way. By this inclusion, the writer is saying you are going to be tempted to quit. Don't. And so when I feel those times in my life where the presence of joy just doesn't seem to be like it ought to be, come to an obvious realization there's something that needs to change, but don't stop. Like Him, this joy is going to help us to finish. Because what we're seeing before us is that God is with us. He's on our side. He wants us with Him eternally. And that we have brethren who also want that. Thank you, Brandon, for your words this morning. And how many could repeat that same refrain? Different situation, but you've seen brethren rally to you. That should bring joy. In the midst of times where you think, I just can't get through this, and you've got this swarm of brethren around, that is God's answer to you that, oh yes, you can get through this. Who for the joy set before Him endured the cross, so that for the race set before us, we can also endure. Here's what verses 22 through 24 tell us. You're there. If you're a Christian, you're there. You've come to Mount Zion, city of the living God, heavenly Jerusalem, to innumerable angels in festal gathering, to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. That should bring us joy. Because this is both where we are and where we will be. We are enrolled in this city, and we will be in this city when the race is endured. There's an old hymn that ended, when with the ransomed in glory. It talks about being there in heaven and seeing the face of Jesus. The writer says, when we're there with the ransomed in glory, with His face that we're looking upon, Charles Gabriel includes in the next line in that verse, "'Twill be my joy through the ages to sing of His love for me." That's why He stood amazed. And that's why we stand amazed. We can be a joyful people, just as Jesus had that joy set before Him. So perhaps this morning you're ready for that. You can stand before this congregation, make that good confession of faith, be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, and be overwhelmed with an outpouring of joy from everyone in the room. Or if that's too scary, we can run everybody out. And they'll be just as happy, knowing that you are now enrolled in that city. Maybe your joy is not where you want it to be. We'll pray with you if that'll help. We'll pray together about that. If it's a sin that's weighing you down, no one in this room has power to forgive that sin, but God does, and we can go to the throne room with you. Whatever it takes. Let's be that people who are joyful and look forward to standing amazed in His presence. If you need to respond to His invitation this morning, you can come now as we stand and sing.